I have a very special guest, somebody I've known for a long time, and I hope to know for a lot longer, Brice Ominski. Thank you for joining me today.
Paul, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about this. We're going to be talking about integration and integration architecture. And what, t-
Absolutely, and it's a field that's been changing so much. There's so much that's happened, and as our world is going forward, it's so tied into these, moving from the enterprise and connecting things right to true business ecosystems. I think
yeah.
these are really exciting times, right?
So I'm going to start out with just the obvious question I get all the time, which is, what is integration architecture? Is that a thing? Where does it come from? What does it mean? Like, is it just what is that, whatever spaghetti we make up and we call it an architecture? Does it look like one of those old Western wheels on a wagon? What is it?
Well, yeah, I think in a lot of cases it looks too much like the spaghetti, but in a word, integration is bringing things together, being able to share information across systems. How do we do that within the company? How do we connect systems? And that's pretty straightforward. And then we've extended that to business ecosystems. And there's different types of systems that we want to integrate and connect that vary from something like Netflix. I can actually watch streaming content from my living room and be able to connect. And actually, they can base a business model on that to being able to understand banking transactions and what needs to be done. So I think there's a whole broad spectrum. And I think what's going to be happening too with integration as we go forward, a lot more intelligence to the system. However, it all goes over the fundamentals. How do I connect things and really do that over a network or over the internet? And how do I do that securely? So there's a lot of facets to that and enabling that to get people to really do it. I think it's such an important area that it's often overlooked. And like many other things, the other thing that's overlooked is integrations are at the heart of delivering business value. Sometimes these integrations that are exposed to the public have their own APIs, they have their own, business models, and we can almost look at some of them like API as a product. So I think it's a really rapidly growing field, really important for architects to understand the fundamentals of how to connect things.
As always, this is going to get kind of spicy. I'm excited. Now, my first realization about integration as being important was a meeting in a major retailer where the sales, marketing, and product owners were absolutely screaming at each other about what a customer and an order and a product were. What did that represent? Why is that? Why were, I mean, they were, this had nothing to do with IT. This was sales, marketing, and product.
Oh,
We
yeah.
were there trying to integrate into retail's omni channels and things like this. Now, I was all of 26 at the time. So I was kind of like, oh, these are real grown-ups just literally about to throw chairs at each other. Why was that? Why did that happen? Why is this so
Well,
painful?
that's a great observation, Paul, and that happens quite a bit in large companies, across companies. Any place where you get a group of people that, they're using a system and it means something to them. And they've learned how to express what they mean. They know what they want in terms of that meeting. And now you start to bring in other people and as soon as you bring in other groups, I think words get overloaded. And you start to have people that have slightly different nuances in a different silo. And integration is connecting those silos. So we get caught with, oh, do I capture the same meaning that you have there with that person there? So I talk about a customer often versus a client, versus internal versus external facing. And the real thing at issue is, am I using the same terminology that I can compare and understand that at a really profound semantic level? And I think that's been one of even going way back when we started looking at integration, as a course, around 2020, this is one of the big issues. Different departments in a company would use the same term. Even something as simple as address can be expressed very differently in two different locations. And how do I connect them? And you get that in a lot of areas. You get that in, retail, you get that in healthcare, and you get this idea of a mismatch at a very deep layer. We're at a point now where we can actually start connecting that mismatch much better because of intelligence and being able to actually match them. So it goes beyond just pure integration skills to being able to do it intelligently.
I like that because the small this seems to be so important to people in both the small and the large. And you mentioned address, and it just triggered another one of those integration things where I was working with DHL on a shipping system, and the largest ever at the time. And we found out that there are a lot of places in the well, there were a couple of major places, Ireland, et cetera, that didn't have zip codes. And it was kind of like, well, your address included things like the third right after the tree next to the church, and you're like, okay, how do I deal with that? And so you start getting these real world problems, and that's the business and the technology, right? Now tell us about the flip side of that. Well, you talk about the course. What was the germination of an architecture course around integration? What's that brainchild there related to bringing these two worlds a little closer to success repeatably?
Great question. And Paul, we started looking at this from an ISA global perspective. I think it was around 2020, and really starting to understand how do we connect things, how do integration architects do their job. We started to look at some of the best practices, and we wanted to reach out to companies like Microsoft, Boeing, Chevron. What do you do? What are the best practices? What works and what doesn't work? And at that time, a lot of really rich information. There was a lot of information around integrations that work. APIs were in place, microservices were, I think, starting to really catch on at that point in time. And so we had some really fundamentals around using them. I think what's been happening more recently when we look at this is this whole wave of intelligence is coming on us. And you're getting discussions, and even people like Satya Nadella, right? Like SaaS might disappear to and give way to a middle layer, a business logic layer that's actually driven by intelligence, but that middle layer is still an integration layer. And that middle layer still needs to communicate to different silos. Like I can't change every system in the world, but I do need to talk to those systems, right? And I think as we start to open that up a lot more, we're going to get more communication. I think integration is going to go off the table, actually, driven by this intelligence that we're looking at right now.
You mean off the table and even it's sky high
It's
or more like
sky
it's
high.
not
It's
going to
just
be?
going to go. I think
Oh,
we're going to
okay.
need to integrate more. We're going to have business ecosystems. There's a great book. I think it's something like service oriented, and this idea of service orientation and what it means from a customer perspective that I get. It's not like I'm buying a product, I'm buying an experience. And as soon as you make that transition from buying a product to an experience, you start to involve whole ecosystems to deliver that
Yeah.
experience to an individual.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that we should carefully identify that that's not service orientation in the sense of SOA. You're talking about service orientation in the sense of an entire product ecosystem, APIs that support your product when customers are using it. I've got a camera right here that connects to my Wi-Fi, that connects to and it downloads BIOS to it, and I've got software that connects to it live, and I can actually run it now from my phone, and it's literally a piece of software, not a camera, and that's not including the more even some of the other products like our cars, right, where you're dealing with a piece of software that is so dynamically connected and transfers so much data at all times that it's almost its own data center.
And look at the range that we're covering there. Really, I need to still deal with banking transactions. I'm
Hmm.
still going to have this transactionality in what I'm doing. I may still do banking transfers at one end of the scale that take forever. Hopefully they don't have to take overnight anymore. Like they're moving quicker. And then what you're pointing to is, oh, I've got events happening. I'm connecting to the Internet of Things. I have real time stuff happening, and there's this mix of technologies that I need to use. So it's not one flavor of integration everywhere. There's a variety of things, and one of the most important things an architect needs to do is understand fundamental principles. And we can't even envision some of the things we're going to be doing in 5 years with integration, but we can work from first principles to build those out.
Well, let's talk about that because I'm glad you brought that up. You had mentioned microservices before. We've already talked about we've mentioned SOA, but tell me what kind of basic principles are you finding are important to architects to know repeatedly, meaning that they need to be able to know how the integrations work to be able to envision these future business product and technical ecosystems.
Great question. I think there's a lot of principles. I think leading is this idea of decoupling the interface and the integration from the underlying processing that's at the endpoints. So, in other words, if we're looking at something and I want to expose what I'm doing, that's very different than implementing it. I can actually expose it. So, I think that's like this decoupling is one of the first key architectural principles around understanding integrations and how to implement them. There's a lot more, and I also feel that there's a lot of patterns already that we can use and a lot of reference architectures. I'm very influenced by the work of Gregor Hoppe, for instance, when we look at some of the patterns and messaging patterns. And I think the other thing is they're like good chess games, right? They just bring out the best moves and the best combination of principles to use at a point. So I think it's important to study them, but also realize that you're going to be at some point, you're going to be going outside of that if you're an integration architect in the future. You're going to need to understand those principles, but you're going to be working on other things that build off those principles. And some of those things I can't even imagine what they look like right now.
So a lot of the things that we've done have been good for are good as underlying for more business oriented and more software or information or infrastructure style architects. Is your approach in the bit about in your training material, is that focused on just one type of those? Is it more like underlying all of them? How does that work? If I'm a one of those people, why would what am I gonna kind of get away from? What do I need to learn to be good at integration in my area?
So, what do you mean by one of those people? Can you elaborate a little
Sorry,
bit?
business information infrastructure and software, which are those kind of recognized specialization types, where they may have a very different focus in their daily work.
Coming into integration, we need to, realize that there's different motivations for an integration. Sometimes I'm just connecting two systems,
Mhm.
and I'm always going to be just connecting two systems, and I may use, an enterprise, microservices to connect them. I may choose, a bunch of standard stuff. At some point, though, I may also want to expose that into a profitable model. And at the end of the day, I think this is where the real opportunity comes, say with APIs, is how do I build that into a business model? So the approach that we take, well, you know what, even I guess with internal clients, you could argue that you're delivering value to the company with that integration, right? So I believe that everything that we do in an architecture is traceable to business value. If it's not traceable to business value, there's a big question, why are we doing that? And we've actually done that in some of our core workshops where we actually go, okay, what does this component do? How does it deliver value and trace that upwards, right? And I think that's the start of understanding good architecture. It's what am I trying to do here? How does this fit in with the strategy? How do I win with the clients? I think the second part of that is how do I construct good integrations that I actually have a business model? And especially as I expose them, there's going to be a lot of new questions coming out around these business models. Like we've got some today, you have integrations like affiliate models with Amazon, for instance. You have premium services. A lot of these things where we expose APIs for money, basically. But I think it's going to get even more sophisticated when we start to realize that there's models where I have information that I might want to share with somebody and I need to track. So how do I do that in the integration and say, yes, you borrowed some data from me. Okay, now it's mine though, and I want to get my fee for its usage, basically, right? So we're going to have added into this ecosystem information stewards, right? And this idea that I give away confidential information, I think is going to sort of change to I'm going to sell confidential information down the road, but that's a little bit down the road a bit. I think immediately what we want to do is make sure that we have APIs and models that allow for these business ecosystems to evolve. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have is these ecosystems start with some system today. And guess what? In 6 months, that system we put in today is already out of date. There's already some new ideas about how I should implement the integration. So, how do we deal with it? Realizing that you can't just change, I'll call it modern legacy. You just can't change a core banking system that I just put in. There's so much work involved even if the integration space advances. And so that's the other question I think we need to answer is how do I set that up to be, in a way, future proof?
So, speaking more on the how do I build these systems in deliver at least,
Yeah.
right? Design. Are you mentioned Gregor, and his work in patterns is quite seminal, obviously, in this space.
Yep. Yep.
We also see, we hear a lot of talk about microservices, modular monoliths, hub and spoke,
Yes.
event-driven architectures, event streaming architectures. Characterize for us at first just the compare and contrast sense of those styles of architectures and in your experience, kind of an overview, not obviously we don't have to go into each one, though I'd love that with you, to be honest. And then how do you approach that in terms of maybe early phase architects and more senior architects?
Well, that's a great question. When we look at, the integration space, I think you want to start, there's some very good tools that we have to use. We have APIs that we can implement in a variety of ways. Right now, one of the very, common technologies is this idea of a RESTful API. How do I implement it? But then we have variations of that for special situations. So you start, let's use the RESTful API as an example. I do that. It has certain conditions where it works really nicely. Um, there's maybe limited performance, maybe limited data coming back. And now all of a sudden I go to a situation where I have very sophisticated queries that I need to, go across, and get answers from. Well, your standard RESTful API won't work anymore. And we have specialty things that we can use like GraphQL, putting that into an interface, using a lot of the RESTful concepts, of course, building that forward, doing good architecture. There's a broad range of these things that we need to consider based on where they apply. And it's really having the right tool for the right job. So when we go through the course, we cover this broad range. And we really start the course off with APIs, understanding how to implement them with maybe microservices, how to leverage things like API gateways and technology like that at a very high level. That's like your very standard enterprise kind of activity. When you're doing some real stuff, imagine a Netflix, going back 25 years ago. How do we deliver streaming services to an individual? Well, that took some real creative thinking at the time. And you need to understand how messaging is done and what different patterns we can use. So in the course, we actually go into and explore some of those patterns in depth, right? How do I deliver how do I build a point-to-point architecture maybe if I need it for performance versus a enterprise service bus or a hub and spoke kind of architecture. And sometimes I need to make those choices. A lot of times when we're talking event streaming and more as we go more towards the real time, part of that scale, there's more of a need to understand how these messaging integration patterns fit and how they're impacted by performance and stuff. So it's really important to understand that. And it's also important to understand if you are working on, an API gateway and you got something standard and you see some issues maybe with performance, to know, well, maybe there's some patterns we need to look at here. Maybe things are getting, maybe there's a problem with messaging. Maybe messages are being lost. How do I recognize that? What are the steps I take, to recognize a dead letter and be able to act on it? And so there's a whole variety of stuff in this integration space that we need to deal with. And finally, there's intelligent systems come into the picture. How do I do integrations? This is where our conversation sort of started between disparate systems. And we start to really work with these ideas of, different silos and the subtleties of different semantics and how do I connect them? And we need to consider these things. So the course that we're looking at goes end to end. It gives somebody who's coming into the field an understanding of the key elements that they need to deal with in building out an integration across a wide variety of situations. And the intent is that if they get a new situation, they're going to have enough from that course to be able to pull that with them. And of course, if they're dealing with an existing situation, then that becomes really easy at almost cookie cutter, right?
I would love to have a cookie cutter and easy integration problem, but then I guess they don't call us when they have one of those. And then those easy ones always end up turning into something really hard where everybody's blowing up anyway. Um,
They do
because
sometimes,
they
yes.
didn't look into the depth there. So what's gonna differentiate this in your mind, this course, this approach that you're building out for the Bitterbuck? What's different from this and say an integration course from one of the integration vendors or something like that?
So I think there's three types of courses that you can get on integration. One type is a very vendor oriented course, how to use, if you're with Microsoft, how do I use Azure? How do I use Visual Studio? How do I use the tools almost a very tactical level to build something? And, if you're in programming, these are great courses, but they don't really teach the architecture of integration. I think the second area is much more architecture focused, and you have courses from people like the Open Group and other areas, but again, they focus on a single framework and they don't really talk about how these different technologies in a vendor agnostic sense fit together. Our course is the best of both of those worlds. We start to look at how these architectures fit together agnostically. We go right into the level of coding. We actually go from value delivery right to coding so that a person understands, oh, here's how I code an endpoint. You do need to understand these things. So this is really an end-to-end primer that we're offering. And the other thing that's important is when you walk away from this, and this has been, I think, something that BitaBox has been based on, you can actually go back to any of those other areas and you'll have greater insights to apply. You'll understand, if you're working with Microsoft or Amazon, how do I do this integration in this environment? So we talk about different tools and where they fit into the picture. Some of them are standard across the environments. Like for instance, years ago, there was a tool managing the API definitions called Swagger, and it turned into Open API. Well, Microsoft has their own flavor, Amazon has their own flavor. We teach the fundamentals across both of those, really. What is it doing? What does it support? Why you need it? At the same time, there's also specialty items in those areas that we want to look at. And then looking forward, we want to be able to understand the difference in, different types of intelligent systems. So it's not all large language models these days. We also have, graph databases that we might want to integrate and get intelligent things going back and forth, not just simple queries, right? How do you do that? And how do you start to link in meaning in different areas with maybe one of the better words, shared ontologies, right? And shared meaning.
I was just going to ask you, where do we cover ontologies? Obviously, who was it? Lee, that was a huge semantic web push back in the day that was discussing shared ontologies
Oh, the
and
W3C
how,
stuff and all that. Yes.
yeah, where semantic web was going to take over, and so the ontology editors kicked in, and we had a huge set of meetings on that in ISA. Where do you stand on, because this goes back to that first question, like why does the sales and marketing and product people yell at each other, right? It's just language, it's definitions of things.
It's
Where do you
language
stand on the whole?
yeah, it's language. It's bringing it all together, Paul. And I think ontology and some of these earlier tools, like I used to be a fan of Protege from Stanford, like drive out a taxonomy and use it. It was fun stuff, but we need heavy duty stuff, right? And we're actually seeing I think some of the really leading edge companies right now are building this ontological understanding into their models. Like a great example, if anybody's following, the AI stock race, we have Palantir. Well, the cornerstone of their model is actually an ontology that connects, things for reporting. And so this is going to become more of our future. How do we connect these terms again with things like intelligent systems? How do we connect these terms with things like GraphQL? And if anything, to be a little bit more topical, the idea of doing the right job with the right tool, I think that was really the lesson that we saw in the last few days with this DeepSeek stuff coming out, where they're using these expert systems right now to support what they're doing with large language models, right? And I think that's the same with integration. It's the right tool to share information. It's not just like one, oh, I'm going to use an API driven interface. This is the style. It's whatever RESTful, and we're done. It's the right tool for the right job. And as architects, that's what we really need to focus on.
So I'm curious. So that was wonderful, and I guess I just want to ask that one question, which is it really? Do you think that it's really going to work? AI integration and agents calling, like, are
So,
you really going to be comfortable handing your agent your credit card and going, hey, yeah, book me a trip to Tahiti this year whenever you find the right time for me?
Well, Paul, I mean, do you ever order anything off of Amazon?
I do, but very carefully because even with human systems, I'm very careful with trust.
Yes.
And boy, we've got a lot of those stories, right? The even the in human driven systems, we have a lot of trust issues. And even
Yeah,
when a human fails, it's more forgivable to me than when a system does.
I think it's more understandable when a human fails. We get it, right? Systems
Hmm.
have, especially these intelligent agents, have different failure modes. And this is something that's often been overlooked with AI is, take the regulations away, they're still going to fail, and we need to deal with those failure modes. I think that's going to be one of the big outstanding items, right? And how do you deal with it? And the answer, I think, for now has been, well, put humans in the loop. And, but I think that's going to change going forward. I think you're going to have other agents monitoring other agents. And I also think that you're going to have a level of autonomy with agentic systems that we don't have today. And I'm not talking 10 years out. That's probably 2026 kind of talk. We're going to get that. Like we're pretty close now. And I mean, putting some guardrails in to the responses, right? I think is going to be essential to say, is this within some boundaries? So we may have different systems that even check each other for those guardrails and responses, right?
Mm. Okay. Well, this was quite illuminating. Any final words for the audience?
I would encourage anybody that's really interested in understanding modern integration to sign up and let's explore it. Let's see what they're doing. We cover this end to end, right from APIs, microservices, patterns in the course, right into the fundamentals and event streaming. We talk about live streaming data, real time data. So it's a very comprehensive look at things that I think is really hard to find in one place. So, just leaving on one story, a few years ago, I was working with a client. One of the architects came up to me and said, Brice, you value, you have a discussion, and then you're talking about implementation. Where do you get all this information? Is there a textbook that I can read on this? And the answer is
Mm.
no. There's a bunch of books. And I think a course like this is really one of the first attempts to put that all in one place for people. And you know what? We'll have a great time anyways, because we're going to explore this and we're going to go from yesterday till tomorrow.
Well, I know they're going to have a great time. You're a pretty cool guy to be around. And you can find Bryce's course on ISA Global slash integration dash architecture or just off the front page of the website. And that's about it. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.